Okay, so are we rolling?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to this event entitled All Development is Local. And the name of this event comes from a quotation from the high-level panel on the post-2015 agenda, who pointed out that, in fact, all development is local. That local government forms a critical bridge between the people, the communities, and the national governments. And they emphasized the importance of that, and this is a big change because in the Millennium Development Goals, there was really no inclusion of local governance at all. No inclusion of local civil society, of good governance. So we consider this critically important because that bridge that the high-level panel talked about is more often than not completely washed away. Most of the poorest countries in the world have very weak local government systems, very small allocations of budgets to the grassroots level, and very little autonomy and decision-making authority by the local authorities. So this makes it very difficult to solve the problems that have to be solved to achieve the MDGs and in the future the Sustainable Development Goals. So one of the inspirations for us to get involved with this in the Hunger Project is this woman here. This is, if you want to know what extreme poverty looks like, it looks like her. The typical extremely poor person is a young woman trying to scratch out a livelihood for her family on extremely marginal land with no access to health care, no access to education, no resources really at all. And government for her exists only if it exists within 6 miles, because that's the distance she can travel with her baby on her back by foot. So if government is not within 6 miles, it just doesn't exist, and her fundamental human right to participate in government doesn't exist. So that's, in the Hunger Project, what we focused on and why we've become terrifically interested in this issue, that all of the key sectors that have to be addressed, health, education, all the actions that must be addressed effectively to end extreme poverty depend on having good local governance. And we found that there were lots of global movements working on each of these sectors. There were lots of global movements working on human rights, on the empowerment of women and girls, but there really wasn't a global movement of civil society and government actors who were working for good local governance. And so the UN Democracy Fund gave us a 2-year grant to reach out to people around the world, civil society groups who are interested in this. There are some networks, but that is during that outreach. I met most of you who are at this table and what you're doing relevant to local development. And we also reached out to civil society groups in dozens of countries around the world to do a study on the quality of local governance. And that's this report, the second year of which we have just released at the UN General Assembly. And this is an example of how the Hunger Project takes on strengthening local governance. This is one of our epicenters in Africa. And there are committees at each epicenter for health, for water, for each of those sectors that has to be addressed. But too often those kind of active, citizen-engaged committees just don't exist. For this study, we identified 5 dimensions. Usually, local government is studied in 3 dimensions: political, administrative, and fiscal decentralization. But from our perspective, there's at least 2 more. One is active citizenry. If the greatest resource available to local government is an active, engaged citizenry, real people power for achieving the goals that the community wants to achieve. And the fifth that we were taught by our colleagues in Mexico is that a lot of local government is not well equipped to engage with the private sector, with civil society, on long-term planning. In Mexico, for instance, each government only lasts for 3 years and cannot be reelected. So it's literally impossible for them to do long-term planning within the context of the local government. It needs to exist in some kind of multi-sectoral forum. So we rounded up civil society groups in 32 countries this year to hold a multi-sectoral focus group discussion with government actors, with women's groups, farmers groups, all relevant sectors of society that would have something to say about those 5 dimensions, both how they exist in law and how they exist in reality, because there's often a huge gap between what's in the law and what's been implemented in reality. So they did a survey that was identical across all regions. We made a big push this year to ensure that the MENA region was included, Middle East, North Africa, because local democracy is pretty new in those countries where it does exist. We were able to include a lot more African countries than we included last year, and that's the results that are in this report. Let me just list a few surprise winners. Africa was the surprise winner this year in our rankings. Burundi, citizens in Burundi considered Burundi to have the best decentralization. Senegal, which has recently had a big push for decentralization. Ethiopia, which has made massive investments in community-led development. Finland, who always makes top rankings on every list. Liberia, Indonesia, where we've heard a lot about its decentralization. Mali, Italy, and Malawi, which has just restored local government after it being missing for many, many years. So we're really doing this study and inviting my respected colleagues here because we want to make this a much more hot, important issue on the global agenda. We want the entire auditorium and amphitheater of the World Bank paying attention to this issue. And we thought having an index and having a sort of a competition among countries would help. We want this kind of picture to show up everywhere, where the president of a local panchayat on the left, Shumi Bai, who's the president of her local government in Rajasthan, to really be on an equal footing with other presidents. And so we helped arrange this meeting of the president and president in India a few years ago. But that respect for local leadership at the grassroots level, we think, is completely necessary. So that's why we wanted to host this event. Then, in part of this process, we met this phenomenal movement, mostly in the humanitarian space, but which completely philosophically overlaps us, and that's the local first movement. And Bridget is going to speak to us about that.
Thank you. Great, thank you, John, and thanks for organizing this.
Here, I'll fire up your thing.
Great. John and I met about a year and a half ago, I feel like it must have been, at an event, one of the very first events of the Local First Initiative that was held here in Washington at Oxfam's office, that did bring together humanitarian, development, and peace-building actors. And the Local First Initiative grew out of an organization, originally the work that organization I'm connected with called Peace Direct. And Peace Direct is a UK-based organization with a US presence as well now that finds, funds, and supports local peace builders. And we're very focused on local peace building, but what we discovered was that we kept running into obstacles that were really relevant to the broader field of development, humanitarian, as well as peace building work, that related to the lack of active support and engagement and really allowing local communities to lead in their development. And so the Local First initiative was the outgrowth of this concern to really look across the broader development field and ask some tough questions about why this was so. What are the obstacles? Why does it seem to be that local actors often get left behind? And what might be some possible solutions to that. So the Local First initiative actually began with an initial piece of research that resulted in this book, and it has a number of case studies that point out the problem, a lot of the problem, as well as some of the solution. But we really wanted to dig in on some of the questions that this first research raised about what possible models might be for a different way forward on locally led approaches. So I'll talk a little bit about this new research that we're doing. It's not finished yet. It should be out probably in the next few months, and we'll produce a book of some sort, pamphlet of some sort. I don't think it'll be this long, but it'll be longer than this. And so you can see all the details, but this is kind of a preview of that and where it's taking us. I should apologize first, because this should really be the Local First coordinator. His name is Matt Kennis, and he should really be giving this presentation. He's the expert. He knows every one of these models and case studies inside and out, and has really been leading on this initiative. But he is in New York, where he lives with his wife, awaiting their first baby, and it's too close to the due date for him to travel far. So I said, well, I'm happy to come to this. And I sit on the board of Peace Direct here in the U.S. And just to say, in my day life, I also have been doing a fellowship at USAID and have seen from the inside really how so many of these problems are for all donors. It's not just that local actors and local government gets left behind, but the donors are utterly frustrated as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that through this presentation. So just to give you a basic overview of Local First, what it is. It's a development model that looks first for the capacity within countries and within communities to lead on development. And it also recognizes that a lot of that capacity lies outside the central government. And people often ask us, do you mean local government, do you mean civil society? We mean both, and others as well, private sector and others. Although Peace Direct's work and much of the models that you'll see have been very focused on civil society and their relationship with governance as well. And that the core principle of allowing people to lead in their own development. We try to think about what local means along a spectrum, and we could start with locally led, what we distinguish as locally led, which to us is kind of the gold standard. This is when communities really drive their own development agenda. They decide what they want, they get support to make it happen, but they are the ones in the driver's seat throughout the process. Locally owned would be sort of another part of the spectrum, where maybe there's an outside NGO or donor that provides resources, maybe they even come in with the idea of what might be needed, but there's an intentional transition process of ownership and leadership to the local community. And sometimes that works fine. That can be what's needed and useful in some places. And then locally delivered is really the kind that, unfortunately, too much of the development field is focused on, and too much of how development assistance is delivered happens. And that's where the outside donor really defines what they think is needed. They find an organization to do it, and that's pretty much it. And that's what the Local First initiative's trying to get away from and move up this spectrum towards much more locally led approaches. So through the past year and a half or so of the initiative, some of the very concrete challenges that we found repeated over and over again about development and its relationship with local actors. Four primary areas that we started to look more specifically at in the current research we're doing. One is the reality that donors still have a tendency to look at needs, lots of needs assessments, lots of what are the gaps, lots of what are the problems, and it's much harder to come with a capacities assessment or a resource assessment and really look at what already exists, where can we see that there is potential, there's real capacity, and build on that as opposed to always coming in and just doing the needs approach. And I find this is so true even when people sort of know the words about resource assessments, that still in practice people look at, well, what are the needs? A second area was the reality of power relations and who holds the ability to make decisions. And as much as everyone will say, well, of course we work with local communities, and yes, civil society, we engage, and they engage and we listen to them, the reality is that decision making still happens largely by the donors. The third area is how often we have seen that funding ends up distorting local entities. So even when you go in thinking you're helping, what ends up happening is you undermine the capacities there very much. Certainly local government often that's what happens. And the final area of scaling up. So we know there are lots of small efforts that do work very closely with communities and that can be community driven, but particularly in the peace building field, we have had this experience of, okay, but how do you scale that? Show that that can have nationwide or broader impact, and that's a challenge. So we started looking at these 4 areas and seeking out models that might be positive examples and what we could learn from them. And so I won't go into all the details on these models that came out, but these are the ones that, some of the ones that for each area that we will be including in the research. And just to touch on a couple of them, ActionAid, this is a really interesting fellowship program they run in Myanmar, that they talk about capacity empowerment. And so they train young people as change agents in their communities. They give them leadership training, they give them training in social development theory, and they help them sort out, how can they be catalysts for change in their community, and then support them in doing that. Peace Direct's own approach, if you know anything about us, we're small. We look for not just, are there organizations that have the capacity to manage a program? We look for who are the people who have the commitment and the local legitimacy and the seriousness about trying to change their communities, and how do we support them? And that our value-based approach is that they know best, local communities know best. And our role is to accompany them, to support them, to respond to what they may want from us. And not all these models that we're finding have to be small. So groups, DFID has a really interesting program in Nigeria with a budget of $21.5 million over 6 years, that's looking at how to strengthen citizen engagement in governance and support more state government engagement, actually. And that's largely not through grants to do projects, but a facilitation role of how do we bring people together in the communities, help them identify what are the resources they already have to bring to bear, what's the knowledge they have, and how can they engage. In the second area related to power, we really looked at how can we find models that are better at listening to local entities to allow them to decide, to give them the power of defining the problem, as well as creating the response. And there's a Life and Peace Institute has a great process where they use participatory action research with communities, so that the communities are the ones really defining, say in a conflict context, what is your conflict analysis? How do you see the problems here, and how can we support you in developing solutions to them? The CDA Listening Project, I don't know if people are familiar with that. CDA is Collaborative for Development Action. It's a group out of Boston, and they did a book called Time to Listen, where they did a huge number of interviews. I can't remember how many interviews it is. It's probably in here somewhere. 5-year period across 20 countries, interviewed nearly 6,000 people. Local people who had been the recipients often of aid, and really sat down and listened to them. And that book, there's a book out about it, says everything you would think it says. They don't listen to us, we don't have enough power in deciding how aid is used. They undermine our own local systems. So it was a real validation of the problem, and then they're going back and continuing to work with communities that they've that were part of that project about how to change the approaches. The third area around distortion of local communities. There were a number of models related to this that are quite interesting. The Global Fund for Community Foundations is very interesting. They do small grants focused, say, from 5,000 to 15,000 to small community foundations. So they're actually both trying to build the capacity of communities themselves to be a source of resources and funding and philanthropy. And then Global Green Grants is another one that's interesting, where they very much work with small grassroots groups and particularly have looked at how do we get out of having to have a legally established organization and really fund those nascent groups and efforts that are beginning to emerge, even if they're not established entities. And then the fourth area was finding these models of collaboration with broader impact. Can you scale out? And the program that, is it up there? Yeah, the PO-PIN is a DFID program, DFID-funded program, which has been a real model of trying to have donors think about their role in a different way and more as a catalyst, a facilitator. I've heard the word midwife before, that it's really a reconfiguration of the role of not just delivering dollars, and delivering dollars is, as the solution, but how do we help facilitate a community's growth and development and support them in doing that. And then the Red Cross, the IFRC there, is actually the Red Cross in Burundi. And it's a very interesting model where the Red Cross was not very existent in Burundi, not very active. And through a volunteer-based network, so rather than having to build big staffed organizations or fund people to do things, they incentivized volunteerism. And the Red Cross in Burundi now covers like 98% of the country with good services. So it's quite a successful model. So just to wrap up on some of the lessons that we're deriving from this, these models point to some changes that we think are generally needed in the way development's done. Slower and more flexible financial support. I can't tell you how often I hear doing this fellowship with Inside USAID, I hear people, either donors themselves or organizations delivering development assistance, say, but I've got to spend the money by the end of fiscal, if we just passed fiscal year, everybody's furiously trying to get the money spent. We have to somehow break out of that and recognize that locally led development, it takes time, it's going to be slower, and you need a lot more flexibility with how the funding is going to flow. The point of power relations is really important. I have often said, I think one of the fundamental problems is actually just a matter of trust, and that donors don't actually trust local communities to have answers. They don't trust the local knowledge as much as we really need to. Relationship building, longer term approaches, and process-oriented, iterative learning approaches are all needed. So some of the practical steps we think could be taken. Really building in capacity assessments, going in first to ask